Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Bar Charts with myself, Mark Pack. For this show, I'm joined by Tom King, author of the new pamphlet, The Generous Society, which sets out a vision for liberalism in the 21st century. So welcome to the show, Tom.
Hi, Mark. Good to be with you.
Now, you and I know each other reasonably well, but to listeners, you may be a completely new person. They may even be wondering, this former Tory minister, is this Tom King? So do you want to briefly introduce who you are and your background before we get into the much more important topic of what you've written about?
Happily, I was not Thatcher's Defence Secretary. I'm a Londoner by background, long-term Liberal and Liberal Democrat. Began my career in politics, actually working for Lib Dem MPs in Cambridge, where I worked with Julian Huppert and before that David Howarth, both of whom are kind of quite towering intellectual forces with the Liberal Democrats, and had a big effect on me. But before that, had already been quite involved certainly in liberal thinking, and Iraq was a big part of that, but I think beyond that, I've always had an interest in society, liberal politics, how we describe and how we get to a better sense of what liberalism means for the whole of society and the whole of the country and the world, rather than just necessarily at the individual level.
Yeah.
And in terms of what I do now, my day job is to work in political risk, which is an interesting area to be involved in pretty much all the time, but certainly around Brexit and the US election, to name just two recent events, there's been a lot of volatility. And so the relationship between politics and policy and how that affects the economy is also an area of interest for me.
Fantastic. Yeah. And you've written this pamphlet called The Generous Society. And I think it's got quite a positive reaction. In fact, that's maybe even underplaying it. In some cases, almost one might almost say an ecstatic reaction from many people who have read it so far. And I'll include a link to the full pamphlet in the show notes so people can give it a read themselves. And I think what has really struck a chord for people is this sense of this is what liberalism is about in the 21st century. And we're recording this a few days after the US presidential election, so we might digress a little bit into the impact of that on the outlook for liberalism. But what made you write it? What was your sort of motivation? You presumably felt there was a gap, there was something that needed your words to answer.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, it's been a long time in the sort of gestation. And I think it stems from a sort of pretty sort of cold-eyed view of, where the Lib Dems are as a party, where the UK is as a country. And that's been a process that spans back to 2010, really, or even before that. So I've mentioned several times in sort of talking to people about this vision, this pamphlet, that while the Lib Dems have been successful in many ways in the last 20 years in perhaps carving out a niche for themselves in opposing big problems with what the government is doing. So Iraq and Brexit would be two of the classic examples of that. They haven't been great, I think, at defining what their vision for society is. They haven't been great at putting together an overall set of messages or expressing their values in a way that really is compelling, that really tells people what the difference is between what we might offer and what Labour might offer, for example, what the Tories even might offer. And there's often a lot of overlap between what parties say they want to do for the world. And I think, that came to a head around sort of the end of last year when the election happened. It wasn't great for the Lib Dems. Obviously, it was a demoralising defeat for left liberals and liberals in general. And I suppose I got talking to several people in the party, including some of those I've already named and yourself, about what we might do and what we might need to do to sort of consider strategy and vision better. And then the pandemic happened, and I think that also has driven a lot of thought about. It's created an environment where we can't go back to where we were before. It's thrown up a lot of bigger questions about how we want to structure things, what we want public services to look like, how we create resilience, and how we look after people, particularly those in poverty, but really, I mean, what it's done is give the lie to the idea that we get what we deserve, and that our lives are secure because we make them so. Lots of people are now in very big difficulty, in their personal lives and paying rent or keeping their job or trying to find a new job, and that's not to do at all with them or even government decisions. It's to do with a disease, and that just has raised a lot of issues around how we might want to do things better in the future.
Yeah, and I'll come on in a moment to a little bit more about exactly what you say in the pamphlet. But one thing that I think really struck me about it and is the value of having something that's written by one person. Because if you say, you say it rightly, the Lib Dems haven't been very good at expressing that sense of our vision for the future. And I think one of the reasons, maybe even the primary reason, is that our attempts to do that are normally written by committee, in that the attempts to do that are either things like through a general election manifesto and a manifesto forward. And although the forward might be penned by one person, it has to go through multiple groups of people. So it's very hard to have a clear, coherent sort of argument because everyone wants to add on their extra bit. And, I've often been one of those people wanting to add on my bit, but that's just the dynamic of the process. And also the other problem with something like a manifesto is it's a collection of policies. Yes. And if you think about some of the most influential political books, maybe John Stuart Mill's On Liberty or Hayek's Road to Serfdom, I mean, they've got a bit of policy in them, and you can certainly use them to guide policy, but they're not policy prospectuses. And in fact, perhaps one of the reasons they have both aged so well in that some of their individual examples feel quite dated. And John Stuart Mill talking about people going to the theatre, I mean, that feels very dated at the moment. But, although some of their individual examples feel quite dated, because they're not rooted in policy, they have been able to age much better than. And yet, so our Lib Dem answer normally to how do we set out a vision is a committee and policies, whilst your take has very much been one solo author and essentially no policies. I mean, I think there's, it's not like you ignore policies, but it's not, it wouldn't work as a manifesto, would it? The pamphlet as an election manifesto.
Yeah, no, exactly right. And I think I agree with all of that. And I think, the dynamics of writing in committee are well known. I think the other thing is that when you're writing a manifesto or any kind of policy document like that, a policy paper, you're inevitably writing to a particular timeline. And one of the things that I was thinking about as we sort of discussed how to do this, and I was thinking through what it might look like, was how do you write this in a way that's relevant to the now, relevant to the present situation. Obviously, the pandemic created a big kind of obvious hook to base that on. But also, how do you think about a period that's longer than the next parliament? So this is intended to stand as a statement of principles and values that exists outside of the political cycle. And I think that's really important because the Lib Dems are very good at generating policy ideas. We saw that during the leadership campaign, again, with Build Back Better and other ideas that both of the candidates came out with. I don't think we've ever really struggled as a party for, whether it's local parties or individual members proposing quite big ideas. What we do struggle with is having a coherent overall vision into which you can slot some of those ideas. And I think, what I was trying to do was just come up with a framework and a set of a restatement of the timeless values that we all have, which allows for that process to happen. So I think it certainly, it was a lot easier for me as well as the author not to have to sort of expect someone else to fill in a different section or try and make different parts of it add up to something that was coherent.
And also just being able to say no to suggestions. I remember there was one bit of feedback I gave on one of the drafts where you basically, it was a polite, form of no, but it was essentially no. I want this bit of to be about this thing, not about the other thing, which absolutely is, that's all about what good writing involves is. And although, non-fiction is different from fiction, but in a way, a good piece of non-fiction is quite similar in the sense that you have to have a clear sort of plot and direction through the words.
Yes.
If you're doing a paper that a committee and then maybe even a conference has to vote for, it's really hard to stick on that road because you've got all of these people. I guess it's like a parent going out with a batch of young children, all of whom are then wanting to pull in different directions, and how on earth you just keep but as the solo author, you had the freedom to do what you wanted.
Yeah, and obviously I would have made decisions that sort of people will disagree with or agree with. And I think one of the things to point out is this doesn't necessarily reflect what I think the most important policy issues are. So one of the criticisms that I've had, I think justifiably, is that there's very light touch treatment of the environment and climate change, which of course everyone, I would hope, in the Lib Dems and the Liberal movement would agree would be top priority in policy terms over the next 5, 10, 15 years. However, because I was writing in a way that was committed to placing liberal values into various different realms, but coming back to the individual human, it was not a priority in the sense of how the writing flow worked. So that doesn't mean that I don't value it, and it doesn't mean we won't write more about it. And it certainly doesn't mean that the vision doesn't fit with making climate change a top priority.
Yeah, and I guess the way I think about it is that I was a liberal before we became aware of the problem of climate change. And even if we conquer the problem of climate change, I presume I will still be a liberal after it. And therefore, as you say, although environmental challenges like that are massively important, they also are not, for many people at least, they're not at the heart of why they're a liberal, because they'd be a liberal even without any of that. Obviously, there are some people for whom that issue is the way into liberalism, but it's clearly possible to be a liberal without those issues. Now, we've talked a lot about, as it were, the sort of the process and the structure and all of that without really talking about the actual substance. So do you want to give a sort of your quick top line summary of what the pamphlet says?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the big thing that I was trying to do in drafting this and coming up with ideas for how to do this was to find a fresh way of communicating values that are very old and timeless, in fact. And so I got to thinking, and you and I and others have had many discussions around how to find a compelling way to talk about liberty, freedom, what we might call the pursuit of happiness, those kinds of things, and individual sovereignty, all of these big kind of touchstone liberal issues, but in a way that's fresh, in a way that perhaps stands outside the typical political vernacular, typical language that we might use and that other parties also adopt. And I came back to this word generosity, which obviously is kind of a definition of liberty or liberalism in itself, but also is a great concept because it's directional. So generosity can be distributed in different ways from one party to another, from one person to another. And that enables us to get into the relationships that we have as individuals to each other, to the state, to society. And it's multi-directional, so it can go in both directions. So that was really the kind of kernel of insight that led to the way I structured it. And then it was a question of making the introduction fresh and current by talking about the lockdown, the pandemic, and really what that says about, a society that's been willing and perhaps is becoming less willing to give up some of its freedom, quite a lot of its freedom, to deal with a real crisis, which is a very liberal response. To be willing to give up those freedoms in the short term for long-term freedom. Now, obviously, the government has run into trouble with that, and is losing to an extent the British population's trust and that has made it very difficult. But nonetheless, I just found it quite inspiring, actually, to see how committed people were to the public health of each other, to the economy, to the society. So that seemed like a natural entry point. And then I wanted to loop it back in the second half to this idea of, to the ideas that the Lib Dems have stood for. So the second half is very much based on the kind of classic constitution statement about freedom from poverty, inequality, nonconformity, those issues. And so we wrapped 10 freedoms up in those three headings. And I think within that, there's a lot of actually quite radical potential for policy. But because it wasn't a policy document, we didn't go into that.
And I think that concept of generosity, I think, has an interesting parallel with Joe Biden's approach to the US presidential election this year. At the time we record, he hasn't yet been declared the next president, but it looks like he will be the next president, and it even looks like he may get the same number of electoral votes as Donald Trump got in 2016. So although it's felt quite a bumpy and nerve-wracking road to get here this week, actually when all the dust is settled and the numbers can be put in historic context, it may well be a pretty decent win, not a landslide, but not actually the really close nail biter that it has maybe felt at times this week. And Biden's approach very much seems to be to view your opponents as people that, in part at least, you can reach out to. And it's not just that he's not used language like the basket of deplorables, notorious phraseology from the 2016 election. That will be really at odds. That will be really at odds with his approach to politics. And he's obviously come under fire from some in the Democrats, who the sort of more Bernie Sanders type wing, who have felt that he's almost being too nice to Republicans. And I guess the election result will probably end up at roughly a point which will give both sides of that debate, ammunition, that they'll
it's already started.
He should have won by more, and others saying, no, but look, he ousted an incumbent Republican at a time at which the economy was growing. That's a phenomenally rare achievement, So that debate will happen. But do you see much parallel in that sense between generosity and I guess moderation? Because the word people probably would most use about Biden is decency. Actually, so many people have stories about having, say, lost a loved one and how Biden just was amazing in what he said and did. He's got that real human touch. But the other thing is, he's a moderate in that sense. That's his pitch. So, do you feel that sort of moderation and generosity are similar, or is there an important difference? Is generosity slightly sort of code for middle of the road?
I wouldn't say it's code for that at all, and I would say actually it's if you read the pamphlet carefully, it leaves a lot of room for quite radical stuff. And I think there's a conversation to be had really about the effectiveness of moderation as a presentational device rather than as necessarily a policy device. So I think Biden, it's a difficult thing to read across to UK politics for obvious reasons. It's a two-party system in a much more concrete way than the UK. It's his opponent was even by historical standards an unusual US president, and in many ways this was a referendum on democracy itself. So I think in many ways there's as many lessons to learn for Keir Starmer as there are for the Dems from what Biden's done, perhaps, and it will be interesting to see what the debate is in the Labour Party about what the Democrats have done. But I think to come back to this idea of policy versus politics, it's been fascinating because Joe Biden's platform is actually quite it's less moderate than it would appear from what he has done and said publicly. It's certainly to the left of where Barack Obama was. It's certainly had the influence of the kind of Sanders species of Democrat. He's actually done quite well in reaching out across to that side of things. some people would disagree, but I think it's a reflection of the strength of that wing of the Democrat Party. So, you know, big commitments on climate change, Green New Deal stuff, quite a lot of commitments to other priorities there. They moved quite a long way on criminal justice and police reform. And I think what that tells us is really that it's easier to open space for more radical policy when you are espousing a generosity of spirit, when you have generally a positive view about what politics is for, when even in the midst of a pandemic, which, you know, Biden's message was pretty grave and sober, you nonetheless encourage people to reach for a view of society and the nation that is positive and hopeful. And obviously he's the challenger candidate, so that's the natural line to take. But I think he's trod that line extremely cleverly as a candidate.
I mean, that reminds me of the Yes Prime Minister episode about party political broadcast.
Yes,
where the running joke is, you know, what's Hacker going to say if he's going to give a radical speech in the party political broadcast? He needs to sort of, you know, dress sort of conservatively and reassuringly, and there's discussion about the music, and I think the piece of art to appear on
dark wood furniture and Bach playing in the background. Yeah,
but however, if he's going to make actually a very moderate speech that's not radical, then actually it needs the jazzy music, the modern art, and you know how. But I think there is something about making radical change feel less threatening.
Yes,
as opposed to really doubling down on how sort of you present it as being radical and different and current things are awful, etc. And in a sense, you need both. You need to motivate people by the sense of, yes, things can be an awful lot better than they are, but there's also a risk in terms of how some things are presented that they can be seen as scary, and that puts off people. And I guess the implication from, you know, that comes through quite clearly from your pamphlet, isn't it, is that generosity is a way of giving radical policy positions a sort of a label or a set of clothes that can help appeal to non-radicals.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also a set of clothes that hasn't been worn before. I mean, it's very traditional in the UK to sort of go down either the sort of economic competence route or the, you know, social security route. Let's be simplistic about it. You're either sort of dry and, you know, keen to make sure that the economy grows and, you know, that government spending is limited, or you're sort of wet in the economic parlance and, you know, you want to expand social security and increase the safety net. Now, both of those outcomes are perfectly good, actually, perfectly reasonable things to hope for and try to achieve. But it's a very crowded market. All the parties tend to claim that they can achieve both of those things at once. We saw in December 2019 that, you know, we had two parties that went somewhat outside of that. But the Conservatives arguably played this game better in that they had a very restricted manifesto. They had a very clear, simple message, which was a lie. But nonetheless, it was interesting because Get Brexit Done, it sounds quite dynamic, but actually I think a lot of people heard it as, you know, stop talking about this, please, which I think Biden has also benefited from. The idea that politics is not part of your daily life and stress. So I think, you know, given all of that, the idea of generosity is it's one that, you know, as far as I can see, is an open gap, which you can then frame things in a way that it's helpful and probably not as scary as other things might be.
Yeah, and I think the thing that strikes me about generosity as a sort of a concept is not only does it fit well with that sort of John Stuart Mill type liberal ethos, but it also works well for talking with people who are coming at things from a different political position. You know, if you partly view a political message as being about something that you can use to persuade other people to agree with you. It's so much more helpful if you can start with some common ground.
Yes.
And it feels like generosity gives a sense of common ground. There are, even in the sort of the most banally literal sense of meaning of the word generosity, there are people from all sorts of political perspectives who give money to charity.
Yeah,
there is you can find some starting point, and I think that's an often neglected attribute of successful political messaging, is the extent to which it helps open up a conversation with somebody who might disagree with you.
Yeah, and I think I even mentioned that in the pamphlet itself about the prospect of creating a society in which people have the decision to make for themselves as to whether, in addition to supporting society through taxes, they can give more to charity and they can choose more philanthropic activities, both in terms of their finances, but also in terms of their time, which is something obviously David Cameron talked about a lot when he was Prime Minister. And I don't think we should necessarily reject that as a potential outcome of people having better lives, better resources and more time.
I think it's a shame that the big society concept was so sort of mangled, and hence discredited. In that there are elements there where you can see packaged in a different way. Certainly, to say Liberal Democrat eyes, you can see elements in that where it could have been something that would have been hugely relevant to this year, for example. And unfortunately, the way that the direction that the Tories in general probably didn't take to big society, the way in which Cameron and some of his allies sort of developed that concept and the direction they took it in, and the mess that was then made of it, risks discrediting elements that actually there's still a lot of value to be had in a way that, we've seen this year, that the amount of effort that people have put in voluntarily to helping not only their neighbours, but also complete strangers who live near them, is sort of at the heart of that idea that it's not just about the individual or the state, but there is something very real about a community.
Yeah, and it's organic. I mean, the food banks example is probably the best one. That this is huge network of food banks that are voluntary, that are self-funded, that have played a huge part in protecting people, not just during the pandemic, but well before it. Obviously, you have the Marcus Rashford kind of campaign around free school meals as well, and that just shows you the vacuous kind of nature of what the Conservatives have not done on sort of food security and those kinds of issues. And that's a real shame, because actually, food banks shouldn't be necessary in a country where we're wealthy and collectively wealthy, and the government exists. But it says something about the appetite, no pun intended, of the British people and society to do something generous and radical for each other. So I think it's there, and the problem with the big society is that it didn't actually allow for the role of government in expanding that and achieving it and encouraging it.
Yeah, and I guess part of the problem in practice with the big society was how it was, because of the time, it was seen as a sort of cheap alternative to state provision, whilst what we've been talking about this year has been where there are clearly things required that are above and beyond what the state is currently doing. And so I guess that backdrop just makes it a slightly easier backdrop to work against. But it is striking with the free school meals sort of issue. I mean, just how impressive Marcus Rashford is as a human being. He's I don't particularly follow his sport, but he's amazingly talented at his sport, and he's had much more of an impact on public policy than loads of people who spend all of their lives working on public policy. A really impressive person. But also he's managed to tap into that sense of what people feel is reasonable and fair, in that there are lots of other ways of suggesting the government should give a free handout to a whole load of people, which would not chime in anything like the same way. I think and it's partly obviously because of his own personal, story that this, that gives it a degree of credibility. But also, I think there is, whether it's been consciously or subconsciously on his part, some real political smarts about the particular angle that he's taken. If you think of all the different issues around child poverty, all the different angles to that, which he could no doubt talk really passionately about, this one is one that has so much political traction.
Yes, and I think you're right to raise fairness as the operative word there. I think people just intuitively get against a backdrop where government is spending a lot of money on other things, sometimes well, sometimes very badly. The sums involved in what he's asking for are so small that the argument is so easy to grasp.
And the government, with Eat Out to Help Out, the government was willing to subsidise me going to a local cafe to eat a piece of chocolate cake. You sort of think, well, come on, priorities.
Yeah,
that shouldn't be top of your list of priorities. And it is actually, I think, one of the unfortunate things about the state of British politics overall in that respect is how much politicians essentially are falling over backwards to give handouts to people like me. And you sort of think, I don't think I've ever had to worry about how I would afford my next meal, and that is a phenomenally lucky position to be in.
Indeed.
But there are loads of people who are not in that position, and government shouldn't be falling over to prioritise giving some money to people like me in that world.
Yeah,
and I think the concept, though, gives a really good way of talking about that in a way that I think Labour quite often make that issue sound like one of almost envy and division and dislike, but generosity gives a much nicer way of talking about it, but also one that therefore can reach more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, that's for us. I mean, I'm in the same position as you. I don't think I've ever had to really worry about it. And for us, that means we have so much more freedom because we have that's a very positive freedom because we don't have to think about it. That means our minds are clear of it in a way that for thousands, perhaps millions of people, they are worrying about it. They are expending energy on it. Even when they're trying to do something else to earn the money to buy the food, their mind is working all the time. That's a lack of freedom that's very hard to quantify, but very real. And I think, a lot of the stuff in the pamphlet around freedom from poverty talks about basic needs, basic rights. This idea, and this gets perhaps into universal basic income and ideas like that, the objective there is to take away that pressure. And that pressure is a crushing kind of pressure. It crushes not only our ability to think clearly, but also our prospects for the future in a way that's very, very damaging. And that's a generous society wouldn't allow that to happen.
Yeah. And there was an incident a few years ago which really brought that home to me, where unfortunately a former colleague of mine sort of died quite suddenly. And so I needed to get to the other end of the country at short notice for the funeral. And I remember thinking how lucky I was that looking at the ticket price on screen, it was, it's that much, as opposed to, oh my goodness, how on earth am I going to get to the funeral, or all the effort that would then have to go into thinking about some complicated series of, long coach journeys or mixing lifts with friends, just all of the stress and hassle that would have been added on top. And that was just, one tiny one-off incident in a sense, as opposed to, as you say, that sort of day by day, week by week, almost grinding pressure it can be for some people at times. And there's some very moving writing, from people about just how wearying, just how tiring it is.
It's a war of attrition that you can't escape from. And I think one of the things I've said a few times, sort of talking to people about this vision, is the idea of breathing. And if I could write it again, I would probably put more about this in the text. This idea of breathing has been so central to 2020. Even if it's just wearing a mask, some people find that difficult. But obviously, we've been cooped up in our own homes in a way that we never have before. That for some people is extremely stressful, extremely pressurizing. We're both probably lucky and can move around the house and find different places to work even in the same room, whereas for some people they might not even have a room to work in that's not their bedroom. So that kind of sense of the walls closing in and that attritional, stressful feeling is very real. And then you have other types of breathing, obviously, which are environment connected, the air pollution and those kinds of issues. You've got criminal justice and racial inequality in America, with people literally being choked and murdered by law enforcement. So lots of different ways in which a society that's geared towards punishment, that's geared towards control, that's not liberal ultimately, and not geared towards individual freedom and choice, prevents us from breathing, from having the room to breathe. And I think that's sort of implicitly in the idea of generosity as well, that we should all be looking to give each other and ourselves more room to breathe.
Yeah, that is an excellent note on which to sort of wrap things up. So just before bringing this to an end, if people have found what we've said interesting, obviously the first thing they should do is go and read your pamphlet, Generous Society. Yes. Link will be in the show notes, or just go to Google and Google for the phrase Generous Society. What else would you recommend? What would be sort of top of your political reading list?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there's obviously so many different answers to it. A couple of things that sort of were inspirational in putting this together. Obviously, it draws a lot on beverage and sort of beverage report and things around that. There was a book called The Unservile State that George Watson, I think, was the author, that we discussed quite a bit. More recently, this is very hard to find, and we never actually found the English version again, but there's our sister party in Denmark, Radikale, I never know which way to pronounce it, produced in 2005 a document called Creative Denmark, or The Creative Denmark, which was a 15-year vision for Denmark. And I read that not too long after it was published and was very inspired by it. I thought it was a beautiful, inspiring document which led to very similar outcomes. And then I think most recently, the one that I've been reading, and I haven't finished it, but it's again, if we want to get into the depths and the weeds of how we think as a society, then Michael Sandel's The Tyranny of Merit, which I'm sort of halfway through, but I've heard him talk about a lot, is fascinating, because it's really challenging this whole idea of deserts and the idea that people get what they deserve and that there are winners and losers, and that they should be that should be accepted, that we should construct a policy framework around meritocracy at all. And he's asking really big questions there, and I think that's a fascinating read as well.
Excellent. I will include links to some of those in the show notes, but possibly not the one that we've not been able to find a copy of in English. But if anyone listening is a avid collector of Danish political publications and therefore has a copy of that, please do get in touch. People can
see how wide your audience extends at this point.
Absolutely. So people can find the pamphlet that we've talked about for free at generoussociety.com, or the link in the show notes. And people can find Tom on Twitter at the wonderful handle of @tallgeekychap, myself at Mark Pack, and this podcast at Bar Chart Podcast. And if you like listening, please do tell others about the podcast and give it a rating or review in your favourite, or indeed your least favourite podcast app. Thank you till next time.